On the night of April 28, 1908, in Porte County, Indiana, USA, a massive fire broke out on a large farm owned by the widow Belle Gunness, née Brynhild Paulsdatter Storseth. Within a few hours, the sturdy house and outbuildings were reduced to heaps of ashes. In the charred ruins, the burnt bodies of 3 children and a decapitated female body were discovered. It was immediately clear that the fire had been set intentionally to cover up a crime. The farm owner had 3 biological children, aged 11, 9, and 5, and an adopted daughter, 14-year-old Jenny Olson. The neighbors testified that Jenny had not been living on the farm for some time and was supposedly attending a private school somewhere in Los Angeles. The remains of the children found in the ashes were soon identified through forensic analysis as those of Belle Gunness' biological children. It was reasonable to assume that the decapitated body belonged to Belle herself, since widow's rings were found on the fingers. This was the initial material taken up by County Sheriff Smutzer. The information he gathered during the first 2 days of investigation was as follows. Belle Gunness was born in Norway in 1859 and had lived in Indiana for 7 years. She had moved there from Chicago, where she had purchased a large, well-maintained farm with forest and pasture land. The mild, fertile climate of Indiana was favorable for farming. Hired workers labored on the farm year-round, and the single woman managed the operation well. The former city woman proved to be an unusually capable farmer, and many local widowers and bachelors considered her a good catch. Simple and hospitable, she easily made acquaintances, and it was not surprising that she soon began a relationship with one of the neighboring farmers, the cheerful and charming Peter Gunness, a central figure in the local community. They married in 1901, and Belle added her husband's surname to hers. A year later, they had a son. In 1904, Peter Gunness died tragically. A falling rock struck him directly on the head. Belle received a $4,000 life insurance payout. Sheriff Smutzer began his investigation with the usual method of interviewing witnesses. As often happens in rural areas, there was no shortage of people eager to share their observations. All of the neighbors and farmhands who had ever worked at the farm had something to say about the widow. Stories varied. Many openly criticized Belle for her liberal relationships with men. It was confirmed that she had intimate relations with all the laborers who had worked for her. At the beginning of the 20th century, such behavior was viewed quite differently than it might be now. Some suspected her of involvement in Peter Gunness' death. After all, that accident had proven quite profitable for her. The sheriff was told that one of the sons who died in the fire had once said at school, "My mom killed my dad, she hit him with a hatchet." The statement was passed along with references to children who had supposedly heard it, but the sheriff didn't take it seriously. First, children were unreliable witnesses. Second, it was second-hand information. Smutzer also knew that, before paying out the insurance claim in 1904, the insurance company had conducted its own investigation. When it comes to insurance payouts, companies are known for their thoroughness, and that was well known. If Belle had received the money, there was likely nothing to hold against her in that matter. In early May, the sheriff received the medical examiner's report on the remains found in the ashes. It turned out that the children showed no signs of injury while alive. The doctors assumed they had died in their sleep from carbon monoxide poisoning. The case of the adult female body was much more complicated. Firstly, it was unequivocally determined that she had been poisoned with strychnine. There were no wounds, fractures, or internal injuries that might indicate a struggle. The missing head could only mean that the perpetrator wanted to prevent the victim from being identified. However, the presence of Belle's rings on the fingers made this action seem pointless. Why would a careful criminal decapitate the body but leave behind such identifying evidence, unless, of course, the dead woman wasn't Belle Gunness? If the victim was someone else, the missing head made sense and seemed quite logical. There was also indirect evidence suggesting the body wasn't Belle's. The weight of the decapitated corpse differed significantly from Belle's known weight. The energetic widow was a broad-framed woman, one could even say, very broad. At the beginning of 1908, she weighed 280 pounds, around 110 kilograms. In early May, Sheriff Smutzer was unexpectedly approached by Asahel Julian, the brother of Andrew Helgelian, the very suitor whose arrival at the farm earlier that year had so upset Ray Lamphere. Asle had come from South Dakota searching for his brother. He explained that Andrew had read a personal ad in the fall of 1907, which read, "Comely widow, owner of a large farm in one of the finest districts in Porte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman of means, with view to joining fortunes. No correspondence unless sender intends to follow it up in person." Andrew had written to the advertiser and received a reply. Asle showed the sheriff both the newspaper clipping and Belle Gunnis' response. One phrase from Belle's letter stood out as especially ominous given what had happened later. "My heart beats for you. Come and stay forever." In December 1907, Andrew set out on his journey, traveling from Aberdeen, South Dakota, to La Porte, a trip that took several days. He arrived safely in January 1908 and immediately wrote to his brother to inform him. After that, there were no further letters. In March, Asle wrote several worried letters to Belle Gunnis asking about his brother's whereabouts. Receiving no reply, he finally decided to go look for him himself in late April. The sheriff sent Belle's letter to handwriting experts for analysis. Suspecting a matrimonial fraud scheme, he assigned one of his deputies to check old newspaper issues for other possible ads. He requested Belle's bank records from local banks and asked Asle Helgelian to provide a detailed description of the belongings his brother had taken with him. From this, it's clear that the sheriff was already preparing to find Andrew's remains. Smutzer and Asle then visited the ruins of the ill-fated farm, where workers were still sifting through ashes and debris for small objects. Of all the farmhands and lovers Belle had taken, one man stood out to the sheriff, Ray Lamphere. In 1906, this frail young man, then around 20, began working on the farm and sharing Belle's bed. Unlike Belle's other brief liaisons, this one proved surprisingly long-lived. Lamphere seemed genuinely attached to the woman who could have been his mother. If their relationship hit rocky patches, Ray would typically vent to his friends at the local saloon. Witnesses told Smutzer that by mid-January 1908, Lamphere was beside himself with rage because a new suitor, Andrew Helgelian, had appeared at Belle's farm, clearly intending to propose. Ray was promptly banned from the widow's bed and replaced by the newcomer. Lamphere mourned the loss for over a month, lamenting his fate to drinking companions, but seemed to calm down by spring. In a drunken stupor, Lamphere reportedly once said, "Helgelian won't be standing in my way anymore." At Asle Helgelian's farm, a remarkable event took place, one of those mystical and unpredictable occurrences that happen from time to time in the history of detective work and forensic science. While walking around the vast property of the farm, Asle wandered quite far from the ashes and ended up at a swampy edge of the forest. There were an outhouse pit and a silage pit located there. It is hard to say exactly what alarmed Helgelian, whether it was the foul stench hanging in the air, the extremely impractical placement of these pits from an agricultural standpoint, or some kind of intuitive insight, but he suddenly ran to the sheriff and began insistently demanding that excavations be conducted at the edge of the forest. His reasoning lacked logic but was full of emotion. His urgency was apparently contagious, as the sheriff sent part of his men to start digging. What was discovered over the next 3 hours shocked not only those directly involved but the entire United States. One after another, 4 human bodies were pulled from the silage pit. The stunned sheriff halted the excavation and sent one of his men to the post office to telegram the state governor, the state senator in the U.S. Congress, and the editors of the largest national newspapers. Thus, in May 1908, the previously unknown Porte County suddenly became the epicenter of public attention. What had started as a bloody yet relatively ordinary domestic tragedy for rural America instantly turned into what journalists called nothing less than a bloody bacchanalia. One of the bodies recovered was quickly identified as the remains of Andrew Helgelian, another as Jenny Olson. It became clear that the stepdaughter had never gone off to a private school. She had been murdered and buried in layers of rotting organic matter. The fact that Belle Gunnis had fabricated the story of Jenny's departure, and had spent nearly half a year repeating it to the neighbors, made the widow the prime suspect in the girl's murder. Ray Lamphere was arrested and swiftly brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the events at Belgunnis farm. In his defense, he pointed out that he had been paid in full a month before the fire, had been living with a black woman far from the scene, and had no dealings with the farm owner. Moreover, he had an alibi for the night of April 28, 1908. Smutzer didn't believe either Lamphere or his interrogated partner, and the former farmhand of Belgunnis remained behind bars. Meanwhile, research at the county library produced very curious results. The sheriff was provided with a pile of newspapers from 1905 to 1908 containing personal ads placed by Belgunnis. The businesslike tone and the sheer number of these ads left no doubt that the investigation had stumbled upon a well-thought-out commercial scheme. Andrew Helgilian was clearly not the only one who had responded to these ads over the years. It became necessary to search for other men, or their relatives. Much was clarified after studying Belgunnis' bank account. Smutzer noticed that the widow periodically deposited large sums of money into her account. For example, in 1904, her account suddenly saw a deposit of $4,000, right after the insurance payout following the death of Peter Gunnis. And in February 1908, Bell deposited $2,900, which she had received via a check written by Andrew Helgilian. There were other large deposits as well. For instance, in 1906, the widow deposited $1,500 in cash. The periodic appearance of such amounts could not be explained by any farming enterprise, even a very successful one. It's worth noting that the US dollar at the beginning of the century had a higher value relative to world currencies than the Russian ruble, and America was a very inexpensive country. A 4-course meal at a good restaurant, excluding alcohol, cost about $2. It was reasonable to assume that the money appeared in Belle's account each time she began a new romance, and that these sums were a direct result of those relationships. Once a romance ended, no one ever came to claim their money, presumably because no one was left to make such claims. If this assumption was correct, it was possible to estimate the number of the widow's victims. Based on his analysis of Belle's bank documents, Smutzer estimated that there were about 10 victims. Attention was also drawn to 3 cases of large withdrawals from Belle's account shortly before the fire. The account was not closed, and the remaining balance was still significant, over $300, but compared to the usual balance, it was clear that such an amount could have been deliberately overlooked. The fact that Belle had purposefully withdrawn money before the arson raised suspicions about the premeditation of the crime and careful preparation. Criminalists know, though this phenomenon is difficult to explain scientifically, that poisoners typically use the same poison throughout their criminal careers. The woman whose body was found in the ruins had been poisoned with strychnine. A request was sent to Chicago, where Belgunnis had come from before arriving in Indiana. Investigators had reason to believe that she might have used this poison before. The authorities of Indiana appealed to all citizens of the United States, asking for any information regarding a woman known as Belgunnis Positor Sorensen Gunnis. The attention of the entire nation seemed to be riveted on the investigation of the horrific murders in this small provincial county. Among all the terrifying crimes of modern history, probably only the bloody reign of Jack the Ripper stirred such intense public passions. Meanwhile, excavations on the edge of the swamp continued. More and more bodies were extracted from the pit, which had become a mass grave for the widow's suitors. The further the excavations expanded, the older the remains became. In addition to relatively intact bodies, intact in the sense that they still had limbs and heads, more and more fragments were being found in such poor condition that it was difficult even to identify what parts of the body they had once been. By the increasingly advanced decomposition of the remains, even a layman could tell that they had been buried for a long time. It was impossible to conduct a comprehensive forensic examination with just one county coroner, so the remains were gradually transported to the capital of Indiana. To Indianapolis also came those who had reasons to believe their loved ones might have been victims of the bloody widow. Among the recovered remains were the bodies of 2 children. Apparently, someone who had responded to Belle's ads had brought children along. When this happened and who exactly the deceased were, the investigation never determined. None of the farmhands or neighbors could clarify anything, The visitors had seemingly been killed almost immediately upon arrival at the farm. Occasionally, small personal items overlooked by the killers were recovered from the victims' pockets, mostly trifles like combs or small coins. But on May 20th, the diggers got lucky. They found a silver pocket watch near one of the bodies. The watch had an engraving, which may explain why it hadn't been taken. Whoever had buried it, Lamphere or Gunnis, had shown remarkable foresight, as a personal belonging of the victim could have been very serious evidence against them. The engraving on the watch case indicated that it belonged to a certain Henry Harold. A subsequent check with Immigration Service records showed that this man had arrived in the United States from Sweden in 1897. Interviews with his neighbors and friends confirmed that he had been searching for a wife through newspaper advertisements and, apparently, had finally found a match that suited him. Before leaving to meet his bride, Henry Harold had over $1,500 in his possession. On May 22, 1908, evidence was discovered in the ruins of Belle Gunnis' burned-down house that seriously challenged the theory investigators had formed about the events. While sifting through the ashes, first a dental bridge was found, followed by the lower jaw it corresponded to. Belle Gunnis had worn such a dental bridge, as confirmed unanimously by her former housemates. The discovery of the lower jaw was indirect evidence that it was indeed Belle Gunnis who had been killed along with her children and decapitated on the night of April 28, 1908. These discoveries understandably disoriented the investigation to some extent. If, before, it seemed that the widow had set the fire and successfully fled, the picture of the crime now looked different. Belle Gunnis herself now appeared to be a victim. However, her involvement in the murders of those whose remains were still being unearthed at the edge of the forest was not in doubt. Yet again, it wasn't at all clear whether she committed these murders herself. Someone else could have done it. Her role might have been limited to organizing the crimes or being an accomplice. The study of archives in Illinois and Indiana, inquiries to insurance companies, and testimonies from people who had known Belle Gunnis over the years gradually allowed a rather complete picture of her past to emerge. The picture turned out to be highly intriguing. Belle had lived in Chicago with her first husband, Albert Sorensen. The marriage was short-lived. 2 years after the wedding, Albert Sorensen died of a heart attack. The husband's relatives insisted that Belle had poisoned him. However, no forensic examination was ever conducted, and no investigation was even opened. The archives shed no light on the circumstances of this incident, and by 1908 it was impossible to determine how Belle Gunnis managed to avoid exposure. The story ended quite favorably for her. She received her husband's life insurance payout, $8,500, and became a young, financially secure widow leading a carefree life. It should be noted that in her childhood and youth, Belle Gunnis performed in the circus with her father, practicing acrobatics, balancing acts, and tightrope walking. By the age of 25, she had retained much of her youthful freshness and feminine appeal. Youth demanded pleasures and physical indulgence. To escape the hateful looks of Albert Sorensen's relatives, she left Chicago and moved to the neighboring state of Indiana. There, in the town of Austin, she bought a house and for a while lived purely for her own enjoyment. 14 months after purchasing the house, it burned down after having been newly renovated. Suspecting arson, the insurance agents conducted a thorough investigation. Belle Gunnis proved that she was absent at the time of the fire, and the insurance company could not accuse her of breaching the contract. As a result, the fire victim received the insurance money and returned to Chicago. There she opened a candy shop. For many years, Belle Gunnis led a comfortable, well-off life, showing rare talent for handling money wisely. But eventually, this period of her life ended abruptly. Another fire brought her yet another insurance payout and made her freer than ever before. Another move followed, and Belle Gunnis became the owner of a farm in Porte County, Indiana. It should be noted that at the turn of the century, interstate cooperation among authorities in the U.S. was cumbersome and inefficient. Only the cooperation between district attorneys, who all belonged to the Federal Department of Justice, worked more or less smoothly. Coordination in police investigations, however, was severely hampered. If a criminal operated in multiple states, the police faced significant challenges in conducting investigative actions. This low level of cooperation among police forces across states was one of the main reasons behind the establishment of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, in 1930. A major breakthrough in the investigation was the eventual discovery of one of Belle Gunnis' suitors who had survived. John Anderson was among those who responded to the newspaper ad and contacted the matchmaking agency for the address of the attractive widow, farm owner. The police obtained a list of such men from the agency and attempted to locate each of them. Some were found, but they were men Belle Gunnis had never invited to visit. Evidently, their letters had not interested her. John Anderson, however, received a favorable reply from her and arrived at the farm. After a very warm welcome and an evening spent in pleasant conversation, Anderson was invited to spend the night in the house. He awoke in the early morning with a strange sense of unease and, opening his eyes, saw Belle Gunnis standing next to his bed holding a candle. The woman silently stared into his face, and there was an extremely strange expression in her eyes. He later told the police officers questioning him. This scene filled him with terror. Belle Gunnis held no weapon in her hands and did not utter a single threatening word, but the psychological shock Anderson experienced was so great that he immediately dressed and left the house that same night. Without a doubt, this intuitive sense of unspoken danger saved his life. In the summer of 1908, some curious developments unfolded in the investigation of the murders at Belle Gunnis' farm. Among the most important were two witness testimonies that were critical to the investigation. The first was that Ray Lamphere had been seen near the farm on the night of the fire. The reliability of this statement was questionable. It seemed odd that the neighbor who allegedly saw Lamphere had remained silent for so long. It's reasonable to suspect that this might have been a police ploy. Although Lamphere had an alibi provided by his partner, no one doubted that this former farmhand was deeply involved in what had happened at the farm. After all, he had been Belle Gunnis' most loyal servant for over 2 years. Lamphere stubbornly denied all accusations as long as they related to arson and murder. Apparently, when investigators realized they couldn't extract a confession, they changed tactics. Charges of complicity in the murders were dropped, but the charge of arson was reinforced by this new testimony. In this way, it was made clear to Lamphere that while he might escape the death penalty, he would never leave prison. The second important event was that the sheriff received information about an alleged sighting of Belle Gunnis after the fire on April 28 by a person who knew her well. This person claimed to have seen the widow at the very end of April, many miles away from Porte County. By then, investigators had already established with certainty that up until the evening of April 27, 1908, Belle Gunnis could not have been on the road where she was supposedly seen. All of her movements and meetings starting from the second half of the month had been meticulously reconstructed and carefully examined. The value of this testimony was, of course, significantly diminished by the fact that the witness could not specify the exact date of the encounter. Moreover, he did not interact with the woman, meaning there remained the possibility of mistaken identity. However, due to Belle Gunnis' considerable obesity, she had such a distinctive appearance that confusing her with someone else would have been rather difficult. In any case, the report that the widow had been seen alive and well after the evening of April 27, 1908, once again fueled serious doubts about her death. Returning to Ray Lamphere, it should be noted that he eventually realized the hopelessness of his situation. In August 1908, he confessed to arson. According to his version of events, the motive for the arson was jealousy and resentment over being fired from the farm. He claimed he had not killed anyone and had no knowledge of who could have murdered and decapitated the woman whose body was found in the ruins. Regarding the bodies discovered at the edge of the swamp, Ray Lamphere also said nothing, citing his complete ignorance. What he said sounded rather incoherent and illogical, explaining neither the presence of a lethal dose of strychnine in the body of the decapitated woman nor shedding light on the fate of Belle Gunnis' Paul's ether. Nevertheless, this confession was enough for Ray Lamphere to receive a 25-year prison sentence. Considering that by that time he had been diagnosed with rapidly progressing tuberculosis, no one doubted that his imprisonment would be for life. The work of the forensic team with the remains found at the edge of the swamp continued until the end of 1908. Eventually, experts agreed that the total number of victims was 14. The earliest of these people were likely killed as far back as 1904. At the very least, one of Belle Gunnis' farmhands, a certain Thomas Lindboe, had disappeared in 1905. His remains were identified, and they were not even the oldest among the findings. Of the 14 people murdered at Belle Gunnis' farm, not counting the bodies of her own children found in the ruins of the house, 6 were identified: Andrew Helgelian, Jenny Olsen, Thomas Lindboe, Henry Harold, John Moe, and Olaf Svenherud. The other bodies and body fragments were never identified. Belle Gunnis was searched for thoroughly and for a long time, but she was never found. One could say that the investigation into the murders committed at the House of Death in La Porte ended there. Like the Maximenko case, featured on our website, this is yet another example of a complicated and ultimately unsolved crime, eloquently demonstrating that justice does not always prevail. However, this story has an interesting continuation that should certainly be mentioned. In December 1909, Ray Lamphere died of tuberculosis. Under pressure from the prison administration, police officials, state authorities, and with the bishop's permission, prison chaplain Reverend E. Schell, who had heard Lamphere's final confession, publicly disclosed what he had heard. There is no need to elaborate much on the ethical and moral implications of such an act. Its cynicism is obvious. In his defense, the Reverend later claimed that too many people longed to learn the truth about the crimes in La Porte, and that these expectations deserved to be met. Be that as it may, Ray Lamphere's confession turned out to be much more detailed than the admission he had made in the summer of 1908. On his deathbed, the lover of the Black Widow revealed that on the night of April 28, 1908, he was indeed at the farm. There, using chloroform, he put Belle Gunnis' children to sleep. His African-American mistress helped him with everything. He also told the priest that he had previously personally witnessed Belle Gunnis murder one of her suitors with an axe, while another was given a drink containing a lethal dose of strychnine and never woke up. Finally, Lamphere admitted that he had helped bury yet another of Belle's victims by the swamp. Thus, the police and the public finally obtained testimony that could be trusted. Although it came late and without the possibility of verifying details, there was finally confirmation that Belle Gunnis Paul Zether Gunnis was indeed the perpetrator of the murders at the farm. At the same time, Reverend E. Schell's statement gave rise to conflicting hypotheses. The first suggested that Ray Lamphere, on the night of April 28, 1908, killed not only Belle Gunnis' children, but also Belle herself. Murder out of jealousy, despite the farmhand's pathetic and frail appearance, was conceivable. However, such a murder would not have required the execution of the children, especially in such a cruel manner, by drugging and then burning them. Many psychologists and psychiatrists who have studied the mysteries of the House of Death over the decades since then consider this version the least likely. The second hypothesis proposed that Belle Gunnis herself killed her children, set the house on fire, and escaped the scene of the crime. Thus, Ray Lamphere's statement about drugging the children with the help of his mistress should be seen as a false confession. The reasoning behind such actions remains unclear. It's hard to imagine that a believer on their deathbed, during their final confession, an important spiritual act summarizing one's life, would seriously choose to protect his old lover by incriminating himself. Finally, there is a third, eclectic hypothesis combining elements of both. It is quite plausible that Ray Lamphere did indeed put the children to sleep and set the house on fire, while Belle Gunnis staged her own death. She murdered an unidentified woman, put her own rings on the woman's fingers, decapitated her, removed the lower jaw from the severed head, and extracted 3 teeth to match Belle's own dental profile, leaving her own dental bridge nearby. She likely took the rest of the head with her and destroyed it to prevent identification. It's possible that she carried out this preparation even before the night of the fire, using the evening of April 27th and the night of April 28th to disappear more thoroughly. The widow had likely been preparing her escape in advance. It seems probable that Andrew Helgelian's search for his brother, already killed by Belle, served as the signal for her flight. She withdrew money from the bank in 3 installments to avoid suspicion, dismissed her most loyal servant, Ray Lamphere, and likely counted on the fact that such a miserable character would not attract the attention of investigators. Moreover, Lamphere still had a vital role to play, murdered the children and thoroughly burned the farm. Apparently, Lamphere undertook this terrible job, believing that after the investigation, he would reunite with his beloved mistress. There may indeed have been a real plan for such a meeting. However, that plan was ruined by Lamphere's arrest. While he still hoped for that reunion, he kept silent. When he realized that such a meeting would never happen, he began fighting for leniency by confessing to setting the fire. The American criminologist and psychiatrist Melvin Reinhardt, author of the fascinating book Sexual Perversions and Sexual Crimes, came to the conclusion, based on his study of the investigation materials of the La Porte murders, that Belle Gunness not only survived but also successfully legalized her identity and lived a long life. Reinhardt believed that Belle Gunness was a sadist, cunning and ruthless. In all of her murders, there was undoubtedly a powerful sexual motive. This is precisely why her careful selection of suitors, and accordingly, future victims, was no coincidence. Passive, weak, and utterly lacking in masculinity, Ray Lamphere apparently attracted her as a partner to such an extent that she could not bring herself to kill him, understanding that finding another such obedient slave would be nearly impossible. As with any maniac, according to Reinhardt's theory, Belle Gunness must have experienced periods of remission, lucid intervals, during which she would regain the ability to perceive and evaluate reality more adequately. After fleeing the farm and the state of Indiana, Reinhardt assumed she was able to objectively assess the colossal risk she had taken by allowing the murders to continue amid an escalating investigation. Realizing that she needed to break the fatal cycle of killings, she would have had to turn to a psychiatric facility for help. Reinhardt studied archival records from that era and seemingly identified several patients in hospitals across different states who matched Belle Gunness' description and the medical history of her presumed disorder. Melvin Reinhardt also attempted to analyze the conditions that might have prevented Belle Gunness from becoming a serial killer. In his opinion, this woman, being a sadist, actually needed to encounter an even more ruthless sadist, someone who could completely suppress and dominate her. There is nothing contradictory in this assumption when compared to real-life experience. Psychiatrists and sexologists know well that there are no absolutely passive or active homosexuals. Each of them inevitably seeks to experience both roles. The same applies to sadists and masochists. This group also carries a subconscious inclination toward role reversal. If, at a certain point in her life, Belle Gunness had met a dominant, brutal male who degraded and tormented her, she most likely would never have embarked on the path of mass murder. But to the misfortune of her victims, such men typically do not look for partners through personal ads, a fact psychiatrists explicitly note. At the beginning of the 20th century, sexology and psychiatry were only just beginning their long journey of development. Many of the key concepts and frameworks that these fields operate with today simply did not exist yet. The works of Sigmund Freud, which successfully described the formation of pathological personalities, were not yet widely recognized. The fascinating and in some ways paradoxical research of John Calhoun, dedicated to alternative communities, of cannibals, rapists, and serial killers who instinctively work against the biological preservation of the species, had yet to be published. Robert Ardrey's The Territorial Imperative, with his famous dominance theory, without which a deep analysis of serial murder phenomena is impossible, had not yet been written. Therefore, it must be admitted that County Sheriff Smutzer, who led the investigation at its initial stage, had little chance of fully comprehending the case he was dealing with. And Belle Gunness, Brynhild Paulsdatter Sorensen Gunness, entered the annals of criminology as a rare and therefore particularly terrifying type of serial killer, a woman.